Alicia Carter had worked hard for everything she had achieved. A young, ambitious African-American woman, she had climbed the ranks of the FBI, earning her place with determination and grit. Today, however, she wasn't in the field hunting down criminals or investigating complex cases. She was on a rare day off, in the one place where she could feel somewhat normal, a small, quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of the city. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on the latest parts. Your support means the world, and we'd love to have you with us as the tension builds. The hustle of New York City was always chaotic, but for once, Alicia was determined to escape it, even if just for an hour. She pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling the bite of the cool air as she entered the cafe, the warmth inside immediately wrapping around her like a comfort. The dim lighting and soft murmur of conversations created an oasis of peace. It was the one place where she could disconnect from her role as an agent to simply breathe and be. She ordered her usual, a cappuccino, and found her favourite spot by the window where she could people watch while sipping her drink. She settled into the chair, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for a moment to let the quiet seep into her bones. The noise of the city outside faded away, and for a few minutes Alicia felt completely at ease. She didn't have to be on high alert today. She didn't have to be Alicia Carter, FBI agent. She could just be herself. But just as she was beginning to unwind, her peace was shattered by the sound of the door opening. The cafe's atmosphere shifted as a tall figure stepped in, cutting through the serenity. Alicia opened a man in his early 30s, wearing a dark blue police uniform. His sharp features and short-cropped hair gave him a disciplined look. He scanned the cafe with a professional's gaze before his eyes locked onto hers. Something about the way he looked at her sent a small shiver down her spine. At first, Alicia thought it was just a moment of paranoia. She had been trained to read people, to sense when something was off. But in that instant, her instincts screamed at. The officer made his way toward her table, his steps deliberate, his eyes never leaving her. Alicia watched him carefully, wondering if he was going to pass by or if something else was coming. The closer he got, the more uneasy she felt. He stopped in front of her table and stood there for a moment as though deciding something. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm but not particularly threatening. "Are you loitering here?" Alicia blinked, caught off guard by the question. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She had never seen this officer before, and yet there was something strangely familiar about the way he spoke. There was no greeting, no introduction, just an accusation, and it didn't make sense. "I'm sorry," Alicia responded, her voice steady but her mind racing. "Loitering? I'm just sitting here enjoying my coffee. What are you talking about?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as if he was processing her response. Then he took a step closer, his gaze never leaving her. "You don't seem to be doing anything else, and you're clearly not a paying customer. I need to see your ID." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. She had been in situations before where her professional demeanour had been challenged, but never like this, never so brazenly. She'd spent years honing her skills to remain calm under pressure, but this moment felt different. She set her cup down slowly, meeting his gaze with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "I don't see how that's any of your business," she said, her voice firm now, though it trembled slightly with the weight of the moment. "I'm not breaking any laws, and I certainly don't need to show you my ID." The officer's posture stiffened, and he leaned slightly toward her, his eyes flashing with something Alicia couldn't quite identify. "You're being difficult, Mum. I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you can't provide proper identification." Alicia stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. Was this really happening? Was she really being accused of something so nonsensical, something so blatantly rooted in prejudice? She wasn't just a black woman sitting in a cafe. She was an FBI agent. Yet none of that seemed to matter here. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, and she knew they were waiting to see how she would respond. But Alicia wasn't about to back down. She had faced bigger challenges before, and she wasn't going to let this man intimidate her into submitting to his unwarranted authority. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally, standing her ground. "If you want to arrest me, you can, but I won't leave. I've done nothing wrong." The officer hesitated, clearly not expecting her resistance, But after a tense pause, he scoffed and backed away, muttering something under his breath. Alicia remained unmoved, but her heart was racing. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was something deeper, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. As he walked away, Alicia's mind was spinning. The humiliation she felt was profound. But more than that, it was the recognition that this encounter, this single moment, was symptomatic of a much larger problem. She had been unfairly targeted, singled out because of the colour of her skin. The officer had made assumptions about her before even speaking to her, based entirely on her appearance. It was the kind of bias that she had encountered far too many times in her life, and yet it still stung, still left her feeling powerless. Alicia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her fingers around her now cold coffee cup. The incident was over for now, but it wasn't over for her. She knew that she had to do something. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of behaviour to persist, a system that allowed people like Officer Donnelly to get away with their abuse of power. She made a silent vow to herself in that moment. She would not let this slide. She would find a way to hold him accountable, and she would do it for every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, unjustly treated or humiliated simply because of their skin colour. Alicia Carter couldn't stop replaying the confrontation with Officer Donnelly in her head. Her day, which was supposed to be a peaceful respite from the high-stress life of an FBI agent, had quickly turned into a nightmare. The cafe, once a sanctuary where she could sip coffee and unwind, now felt suffocating. The feeling of Donnelly's condescending gaze and the way he had dismissed her so easily lingered in the back of her mind. She had always known that racism existed in society, but this was different. This wasn't just casual bias or a rude remark. It was blatant, public and confrontational. It was a reminder that no matter how accomplished she was, no matter how much training she had received, her identity as a black woman made her a target. And it wasn't the first time she had experienced this type of discrimination, but it was the first time in such a public, humiliating manner. The officer had seen her sitting alone, enjoying her coffee, and immediately assumed she was up to no good. Without any reason, without any provocation, he'd approached her with a sense of authority and accusation. The situation was not only infuriating, but also deeply painful. Alicia knew she couldn't just let it go. She took a deep breath and scanned the cafe. The morning rush had died down, leaving only a few regulars scattered at tables. Some of them had witnessed the confrontation, and she could see the hesitant looks they were giving her as they sipped their drinks. Some seemed to want to say something but were unsure of how to approach her. Alicia wasn't sure if it was out of fear or uncertainty, but she knew she had to start speaking up, not just for herself, but for all those who might have experienced the same kind of treatment and stayed silent. Alicia stood up from her table, determined. She walked toward the counter where the young barista who had served her earlier was standing. The girl noticed her approach and looked at her nervously, unsure of what to expect. "Excuse me," Alicia began, keeping her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "I need to speak with the manager." The barista nodded and quickly walked away. Moments later, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanour came over. Alicia could tell she was used to handling customer complaints, but something in her body language showed she was uncomfortable with the situation. Alicia didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to file a complaint," Alicia said firmly. "Yesterday, a police officer named Donnelly accused me of loitering and demanded to see my ID without cause. He treated me like I was a criminal, just because I was sitting here, minding my own business." The manager's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm so sorry that happened," she said, looking genuinely concerned. "But as you know, he's a police officer. People don't typically question them. We try to keep things peaceful here." Alicia's heart sank at her response. It was the same tired excuse, the same narrative that so many people, especially people of colour, had been forced to swallow for far too long. The fear of challenging authority, the fear of repercussions. Alicia wasn't surprised, but she still couldn't help the disappointment that washed over her. "I understand," Alicia replied, her voice steady. "But it's not okay. I need to make sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." The manager nodded again, but there was a clear hesitation. "I'll make sure to speak to him," she promised, though Alicia knew that was probably the end of it. She wasn't expecting a miracle from the cafe manager, But she needed to take this step. She had to try. Alicia left the cafe with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The conversation with the manager had confirmed what she'd feared. The system wasn't on her side. She wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation with a cafe employee would lead to anything significant, but it was still a necessary step. Now, she had to take matters into her own hands. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Stevens, her colleague at the FBI. "Got the records on Donnelly. Let's talk." Alicia's pulse quickened. She had already suspected that Donnelly wasn't just some random officer with a bad attitude. Something about him seemed off, like he had a history of acting with impunity. And Stevens, being as thorough as he was, had likely uncovered something that could give her a clue about what she was dealing with. She made her way to a nearby park, finding a quiet bench to sit on. She called Stevens, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "Stevens, what have you got?" He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "He's got a record, several complaints over the years. Nothing criminal, but enough to raise red flags. There are accusations of him using his position to intimidate and target certain people, particularly minorities." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a random encounter. This was part of a pattern. Donnelly had been abusing his power for a long time, and now he had targeted her. But why? What was it about her that made her his next victim? "Does he have any history of violations?" Alicia pressed, her mind racing. "Nothing that sticks," Stevens replied. "But I'm digging deeper. I'll get back to you with more information soon. But Alicia, be careful. If you're going after this guy, it's going to get messy." "I know," Alicia said, her jaw tightening. "But it's not just about me. It's about everyone he's hurt." She ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Stevens had confirmed her suspicions. Donnelly was not some lone bad apple. He was part of a system that allowed people like him to thrive, and Alicia wasn't going to let it slide. She needed more information, more evidence. She decided to start asking around. There had to be others who had encountered Donnelly's brand of injustice, others who had suffered at his hands but had been too afraid to speak out. Alicia's first stop was the local library. She knew that the public records of police officers were available to some extent. She could search for any reports or official complaints against Donnelly. The librarian at the desk gave her a knowing look when Alicia asked for help finding the records of local law enforcement. "I can help you with that," the librarian said quietly, leading Alicia to a back room where she could access the digital archives. As Alicia scanned through the files, she found several complaints against Donnelly. Some were as recent as the last few months. They were mostly anonymous tips or citizen complaints, but the pattern was clear. Donnelly had a reputation for being aggressive, especially towards people of colour. He had crossed lines on numerous occasions, and nothing had ever been done about it. Alicia's gut told her that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The more she dug, the more she realised just how deeply entrenched this problem was. It wasn't just one officer. It was a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for far too long, and Alicia wasn't going to let it continue. As the days passed, Alicia delved deeper into her investigation, uncovering more disturbing details about Officer Donnelly's actions. She started compiling a dossier of complaints and reports, most of them buried under layers of bureaucracy or dismissed by those in power. Each report was a new piece of evidence, but there was one thing that stood out above all: a pattern of racial profiling. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was systemic. Alicia was careful in her approach. She didn't want to act recklessly. The last thing she needed was to make herself a target or draw attention from higher-ups before she had the solid proof she needed. She knew that Donnelly wasn't just any officer. He was part of a larger network of law enforcement that had operated with impunity for far too long. His actions were only a small part of a much larger problem. As Alicia sifted through the records, one name kept appearing over and over again: Donnelly's partner, Officer Harris. According to several reports, Harris had been with Donnelly during some of the more egregious incidents. They were a team, and their abuse of power seemed to go hand in hand. Alicia needed to learn more about Harris, and she needed to know how deep this connection went. It wasn't just about Donnelly anymore. It was about a culture of law enforcement that allowed this kind of behaviour to flourish unchecked. And that was what made Alicia's investigation so dangerous. She wasn't just targeting one bad officer, she was taking on the entire system. After a long day of research, Alicia met up with Stevens to discuss her findings. They sat in a small, dimly lit cafe near their office, the kind of place that offered a quiet corner where they could talk without being overheard. Alicia slid the folder across the table and Stevens picked it up with a raised eyebrow. "You've been busy," he said, scanning through the pages. "You've got enough here to make a case, but this is just the beginning. We need more than just these complaints. We need solid proof of abuse." Alicia nodded, her thoughts already racing. "I know, but this is just the surface. There's something bigger going on here. Donnelly and Harris have been working together for years, and I think they're part of something more organised. We need to find out who's covering for them." Stevens leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "This is going to get complicated. If we push too hard, we might get in over our heads. You know how it goes. Cops stick together." "I'm not afraid of getting in over my head," Alicia replied, her voice steady. "But I need your help. We can't do this alone." Stevens hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll help you gather more intel. But we need to be careful. The higher-ups won't like this. We could be putting our careers at risk." Alicia knew the stakes. This wasn't just about exposing one officer's wrongdoing. This was about taking down an entire network of corruption. But she wasn't backing down. The next few days were a blur for Alicia. She spent her time poring over records, interviewing victims, and reaching out to contacts who might have more information. The more she learned, the clearer it became that Donnelly and Harris were not the only officers involved. There was a web of corruption that stretched throughout the department, and it was only getting bigger the more she investigated. Alicia was relentless. She managed to track down a former officer who had worked alongside Donnelly and Harris years ago. The man, whose name was Daniel, was now out of law enforcement, having retired early after a series of personal issues. Alicia had to convince him to speak, and it wasn't easy. He was hesitant, suspicious, and afraid of retaliation. "I don't want to get involved in this," Daniel said, looking around nervously. "You don't know what you're dealing with. These guys, they have power. They'll ruin you." "I know," Alicia replied, keeping her voice calm, "but I'm already in this, and I need to know the truth. Who's covering for them? Who's protecting Donnelly and Harris?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice low. "You need to look at Chief Garner. He's the one who's been covering for them all these years. He's known about what's been going on, but he's kept quiet. As long as they keep their noses clean and bring in the right kind of results, he turns a blind eye." Alicia's heart raced. This was the break she needed. Chief Garner had been on her radar for some time, but now she had confirmation that he was involved. If she could prove that Garner was complicit in this web of corruption, it would bring the whole system down. "Thank you," Alicia said, her voice filled with determination. "You've just made this a lot more complicated for me, but I won't let them get away with it." As she left Daniel's apartment, Alicia felt a surge of both excitement and dread. She was getting closer, but the closer she got, the more dangerous things would become. Chief Garner was no small player, and taking him down would mean going up against not just the officers involved, but the entire department. Part 6. Gathering the Pieces. Over the next week, Alicia continued to dig into Chief Garner's history. She obtained records of his promotions, his political connections, and his relationships with the officers under his command. It didn't take long for her to realize that Garner's rise through the ranks had been tied to his ability to cover up misconduct and protect officers like Donnelly and Harris. She was close to uncovering something big, but she knew she needed more. One evening, as Alicia was heading back to her apartment, she got a call from Stevens. His voice was urgent. "Alicia, I've got something. It's big." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I've been going through Garner's financial records. There's a lot of money flowing into his accounts from sources that don't make sense. I think he's been getting kickbacks from private contractors, people who want to keep him in power." Alicia was silent for a moment, processing the information. This was the smoking gun she had been waiting for. If she could prove that Garner had been accepting bribes, it would not only expose him, but also implicate everyone who had helped him stay in power. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, already formulating her next move. "We need to get this to the right people," Stevens said. "We need to go public, but we have to be careful. Garner has a lot of influence." Alicia knew that this was the moment of truth. She had the evidence she needed, but exposing it would come with risks. Risks she wasn't sure she was ready for. Still, there was no turning back now. Alicia spent the next few days meticulously planning her next steps. The evidence she had gathered was substantial, but it was also dangerous. Chief Garner's ties to corruption ran deep, and if she wasn't careful, everything she had worked for could crumble before her eyes. Still, Alicia was determined. She couldn't let the cycle of corruption continue unchecked. She met with Stevens late one night, in the same dim cafe where they had shared so many of their discussions. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air between them. The tension was palpable. Stevens was visibly concerned. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "If we go public, there's no going back. Garner will come after us, and he's got connections everywhere." "I know," Alicia said firmly, her eyes narrowing with resolve. "But I can't let them get away with it. I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing this for everyone who's been affected by the corruption. We need to bring this into the light." Stevens hesitated before nodding. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." They made their plan. They would take the evidence to a trusted journalist who had a history of exposing corruption within law enforcement. Alicia knew that going public was a huge risk, but it was the only way to force change. If they could get the story out there, the public outrage would be enough to bring pressure on the authorities to act. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. The next morning, Alicia and Stevens met with the journalist, a seasoned reporter named Rachel Torres. Rachel was skeptical at first, but when she saw the evidence Alicia presented, her skepticism turned to determination. "This is massive," Rachel said, her eyes scanning the documents with a practiced eye. "If this gets out, it's going to shake the entire department. But we can't just drop this out there without preparing for the fallout. I'm going to need more than just this paperwork. I need testimonies, witnesses who are willing to go on record." Alicia nodded. "I've got a few people who will speak up. It's just a matter of getting them to trust you." Rachel's eyes hardened with resolve. "I've been doing this long enough to know how to handle whistleblowers. I'll make sure their identities are protected, but we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that Garner and his people will cover their tracks." Alicia agreed. It was time to act. They didn't have the luxury of waiting around. She and Stephen spent the next few days working with Rachel, gathering statements and organising the evidence. Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every move they made was under surveillance, but she pushed the paranoia aside. She couldn't afford to let fear take over now. The story broke the following week. It hit the news like a bombshell. The details of Chief Garner's corruption splashed across every major outlet. Alicia watched the coverage with a mixture of relief and dread. The public's reaction was swift and furious. Protests erupted, and there were calls for immediate investigations into the police department. But the fallout wasn't as simple as Alicia had hoped. While the evidence was damning, it was clear that there were people in power who were trying to suppress the story. The department issued a statement claiming that the allegations were unfounded and that an internal investigation would be launched. But Alicia knew this was just a ploy to buy time and minimise the damage. Chief Garner went into hiding, knowing that the pressure was mounting. Donnelly and Harris were placed on administrative leave, but Alicia knew this was just a temporary measure. They were being protected, just like all the others who had been complicit in the corruption. As the days went by, Alicia found herself under increasing scrutiny. Anonymous tips started to flood in, threatening her and warning her to back off. The pressure was intense, and she could feel the walls closing in around her, but she refused to back down. "I didn't go through all of this just to back off now," Alicia said to Stevens one evening. "We've come too far." Stevens was worried, though. "Alicia, I know you're tough, but this is dangerous. Garner isn't just going to let this go. You need to be careful." "I'm not scared of him," Alicia replied, her voice steady. "This is bigger than just him. This is about everything that's wrong with the system. If we don't keep pushing, nothing's going to change." As the investigation gained momentum, Alicia found herself moving deeper into hostile territory. She was called into a meeting with her superior officers, including some who had been at the department long before her. The room was cold and tense as they faced her, their eyes full of suspicion. "Alicia," Chief Jackson said, his voice tight, "you've been a part of this department long enough to know that what you're doing is dangerous. You're not just exposing a few bad apples, you're tearing down the entire structure. This is a slippery slope, and you could be jeopardizing your career, not to mention your safety." Alicia didn't flinch. She knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to intimidate her. to make her second-guess her actions. "I'm not worried about my career," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm worried about the people who have been hurt by this system, and I'm not going to sit back and let it continue." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," another officer, Lieutenant Hayes, interjected. "These are powerful people. You don't go up against them and come out unscathed." Alicia leaned forward. "I'm not afraid of them, but I will expose the truth no matter the cost." The room fell silent. Alicia knew this conversation wasn't over, but she also knew she had to keep pushing forward. There was no turning back now. As Alicia continued to fight, the pressure mounted. The deeper she went, the more dangerous things became. But with the support of the community and the evidence she had gathered, Alicia was gaining momentum. Protests grew larger, and the calls for accountability grew louder. People who had been silent for years were finally speaking out. One evening, as Alicia was leaving her apartment, she received a call. It was Rachel, and her voice was urgent. "Alicia, you need to get down here. Something big just broke." Alicia rushed to meet Rachel, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked into the newsroom, Rachel wasted no time. "It's Garner," Rachel said, her voice tight with urgency. "We've got a whistleblower, a high-ranking officer from the department. He's ready to testify against Garner, and he's got the receipts." Alicia's eyes widened with disbelief. This was the break she'd been waiting for. The whistleblower had access to key documents, correspondence between Garner and several other officers that implicated them in a web of corruption. It was the smoking gun that could bring the entire department down. Rachel handed Alicia a folder filled with confidential documents. The evidence was overwhelming, showing clear ties between Garner and criminal activity, money laundering, bribery, and even ties to organized crime. This wasn't just about police misconduct anymore. It was about criminal enterprises operating under the guise of law enforcement. But there was a catch. The whistleblower's identity was being kept under tight wraps, and they had made it clear that if their identity was exposed, they would pull out of the case entirely. Alicia knew this was their one chance, and they had to handle it carefully. "This could be the end of him," Rachel said, "but we have to be strategic. If we drop this information too soon, it'll be buried. We need to wait for the right moment, and we need the public on our side." Alicia nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. She had to make sure that everything they did was calculated and precise. If they messed this up, the whole effort would be for nothing. The weeks that followed were a blur of late nights, clandestine meetings, and growing tension. Alicia knew that the pressure was building, but she also knew that it was crucial to stay patient. Every move had to be timed perfectly. If they went too early, it would give Garner and his allies time to cover their tracks. If they waited too long, they risked losing the momentum they had gained. Alicia, Stevens, and Rachel continued to work in the shadows, preparing their next steps. Meanwhile, public outrage continued to grow. Protests became more frequent, and the calls for reform became louder. The police department was under a microscope, and every new piece of information added fuel to the fire. But even with all the evidence they had, Alicia knew they couldn't win this fight with just public support. They needed something bigger, a smoking gun, something irrefutable. Then, one day, they got the call. The whistleblower had agreed to meet, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Alicia, Stevens, and Rachel prepared themselves for what was sure to be a pivotal moment. The meeting took place in a secluded park, far away from prying eyes. The whistleblower, a former detective named Henry, was nervous but resolute. He had been with the department for over 20 years, and the weight of the truth had been eating away at him for years. Now he was ready to do what was right. "I've seen things, Alicia," Henry said, his voice shaking. "I've covered for people, turned a blind eye, but what Garner did, it goes too far. The money, the connections with criminals, the cover-ups, it's all there in the files. I can't let this go on anymore." Alicia listened intently, absorbing the gravity of what he was saying. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She had suspected that something deeper was at play, but hearing it directly from Henry confirmed her worst fears. The corruption ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Henry handed over a flash drive with the files. "This is everything you need. The evidence, the names, the transactions, it's all there." Alicia took the drive, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, but they couldn't act yet. The timing had to be perfect. "Thank you, Henry," Alicia said quietly. This will change everything." He nodded, his face a mixture of relief and fear. "Just make sure they don't come for me. I've already said too much." The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. Alicia, Stevens, and Rachel worked around the clock to prepare the final push. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was time to make their move. They reached out to their network of trusted journalists, carefully feeding them the information they had gathered. The plan was simple: release the story, but make sure the public was prepared for the fallout. They couldn't afford to let the story get buried again. It needed to be massive, a tidal wave of public outrage. When the day finally arrived, Alicia felt a mix of nervous anticipation and steely determination. This was the moment that could change everything, not just for her, but for the entire community. She watched as the story broke, and within hours it was all over the news. The images of Ghana's corruption, the dirty deals, the ties to organised crime, it all came crashing down. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted in the streets, and calls for Ghana's resignation were heard from every corner of the country. The department was in disarray, and the political fallout was immense. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer anymore, it was about a system that had allowed this behaviour to persist for decades. But even as the world watched, Alicia knew this was just the beginning. Ghana would fight back. He would try to silence her, to discredit her. But Alicia wasn't afraid anymore. She had the truth on her side, and the people were behind her. This was the fight of her life, and she was ready to win it. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on the latest parts.